Unit 2, Presentation 3, the factors the Parole Commission considers. As was discussed in Unit 1, parole decision-making entails a very wide discretion. There is no burden of proof that has to be met. The things considered are both forward-looking and backward-looking, and there are both objective and subjective aspects to the assessment. This is somewhat reflected in the Parole Commission's own mission statement. Here's an excerpt from it. The Parole Commission uses sound judgment in conjunction with utilizing validated risk assessment tools during the decision-making process. The risk assessment tools are the algorithms, the push towards objectivity we discussed before, and the sound judgment. Well, that's arguably the more subjective element of it. The Parole Commission distinguishes between static and dynamic factors. That's the language you may hear being used. Dynamic refers to those factors which change with time, and static factors are things in the past, things that will never change. As regards the factors the Parole Commission considers in making a decision, there are two places to look. There is a list of factors set out in the primary legislation, and there's also a longer list, set out in the secondary legislation. There is considerable overlap between the two, but they're not identical. We're going to look at the list in the secondary legislation because it breaks the factors down into very specific elements. It begins with 4 general considerations: the circumstances surrounding the crime, the physical, mental, and moral qualifications of persons who become eligible for parole, whether there is reasonable probability that the prisoner, if released on parole, will remain at liberty without violating the laws, and whether the release of the prisoner on parole is compatible with the welfare of society. So when you're looking at factors that the Parole Commission is considering, what you need to be thinking about is, how can I bring things into the parole packet and into my advocacy more generally that helps specifically address these factors, reasons to say that these factors have been met in such a way that the person should be released. The circumstances surrounding the crime, that's obviously in the past. That would be an example of a static factor. The physical, mental, and moral qualifications of persons who become eligible for parole. I'm not even sure how to interpret that, and I don't believe there's any guide to the interpretation of that. What would a moral qualification be? I don't know. C, the reasonable probability that they will remain at liberty without violating the laws. Well, that goes to things like having a good home, having a job, having a support network, being in recovery programs if you have a history of addiction, that kind of thing. And release of the prisoner compatible with the welfare of society. Again, that goes to the likelihood that the person's going to be getting on with their life and not committing any crimes. Track record on infractions would be one thing to look at there, and we'll talk about that more when we look at parole packets specifically. So after the general considerations, it moves on to 4 additional considerations. Whether there's a risk the person won't conform to the conditions of parole, whether release would depreciate the seriousness of the crime or promote disrespect for the law, whether the individual's release would have an adverse effect on institutional discipline, and whether the individual's continued incarceration will substantially enhance his ability to lead a law-abiding life when released at a later date. Again, these are all things that you would be getting at with a well-rounded parole packet that's trying to cover all the bases in terms of support network, good discipline track record while incarcerated, a job lined up, things, vested interests that mean a person would definitely be doing everything they could not to return to prison. So these factors you would address not so much very specifically, but more generally in terms of the whole parole packet. And then there's this list, and it says to make these determinations. So to make the determinations in the previous 2 slides, that is, the Commission examines. So it's going to look at the prior record, prior incarcerations, any time the person's had parole or probation before and how they've done on that. The offender's behaviour and adjustment. Adjustment refers to infractions in the prison environment. Institutional self-help programs, that's definitely something that you cover in the parole packet, as with vocational educational training. Attitude towards society, discipline and other authority. Again, if you say, well, this person hasn't had an infraction for 10 years, then that's kind of hitting that factor. Past use of narcotics, alcohol or dangerous substances. You would address that in a parole packet by focusing on what's this person going to do in terms of recovery. So if it's alcoholism that led them into prison, then the parole packet is going to pick up on that and specify the ways in which being a recovering alcoholic will be addressed as part of their re-entry plan. Emotional maturity and insight, that often comes with age, especially if the person has gone in as a teenager or as a young person. And you can make the argument that they have matured, and there's often so much evidence that you can bring to demonstrate that maturity. Things covered by the sentencing judge or any other professional. If there's any positive things, sometimes in a trial transcript, someone has a really good comment from a judge. You would, if they've got a copy of that, want to incorporate that page at least with the comment highlighted into the parole packet. Employment plans, family status and stability. That's one of the reasons why parole advocacy is about bringing the family into the process. Obligations and responsibilities. There's often evidence that you can bring to that factor from things that people have taken on within prison, like if they've been in the Rescue Cat Association or the Beekeeping Association, anything that needs to show responsibility, basically. Adequacy of the offender's parole plan. Parole plan means the basic re-entry plan, the home plan, the job and support. And then any other factors, well, that's just a catch-all. Recall that there is no right of appeal. We discussed this somewhat when looking at the timeline of parole hearings. So if someone goes before a hearing officer, because the hearing officer isn't actually making a decision, they're just giving a recommendation, there is an opportunity to file an exception to that recommendation, because the recommendation is going to the next tier. That is, it's going to a parole commissioner to be approved or disapproved anyway. So the person can automatically intervene at that point. And if the recommendation of the hearing officer is not a good one from the perspective of the person going out for parole, there's really nothing to lose from filing an exception at that point. And other than that, really the only appeal would be procedural impropriety that you could take to a court, but that's not asking the court to redo the parole decision, to re-examine the substance of the decision. It would be, for example, if the Parole Commission said, oh, well, we're not going to go through our process, we'll just toss a coin today. Or, well, we don't like the look of you, so we're not going to give you parole. That would be procedural impropriety, and that could be brought before a court. One point that often comes up is many people, if they don't get a good outcome, they really want to write to the chair of the Parole Commission. They'll say, right, I want to write to Mr. Bloomberg because this just doesn't seem fair. I've done everything I possibly could, and the panel that I went before just wasn't interested, and I feel I should write to him. And that's okay. People do write to him, but he is a chair in sort of administrative terms. He's not a chair in the sense that he is a higher level decision-making authority that you can appeal to from the other parole commissioners. So there's a limit to what can be achieved from writing to him, but sometimes people just want to get that off their chest. So one thing I would say about once the outcome of a parole hearing comes through is to try not to lose heart, particularly if it's someone who has worked really hard, who has got a good parole packet and just has got a lot of things lined up. and therefore can almost be expecting they're going to get parole, and then it comes back as a refusal, often on the static factors, that is the backward-looking factors, saying, well, you've done a lot of good things, but we don't like your crime. Well, the person probably doesn't like the crime themselves. It's probably something nobody would like, but the dynamic factors which the person had some control over need not necessarily be the ones that the Parole Commission makes its final decision based on. Just recall that that's how the system is set up, and without legislation, that can't be changed at the moment. There's nothing to do about that other than hope that the General Assembly sees fit to amend the factors that are taken into account at some point in time, so it's more within the spirit of the institution of parole and what its roots are. So getting a refusal doesn't necessarily mean that that person isn't to be commended for having achieved a lot in a really difficult situation. And one of the reasons why we've called prepare for parole and re-entry is because we do believe that it is all harvest. If you've done good things, if you've connected with your family and made strides in education and this and that, it's in and of itself, it's a good thing. And when the day of release comes, it will bear fruit.